Imagine for a moment that you've never actually seen clearly, not once, not the world, not others, not even yourself. What you thought was sight was often projection, defense, repetition. Not because you are blind, but because you were trained to see through fog and call it daylight. As Emmet Fox once taught, the truth is never hidden, it is simply misperceived. It's not buried in mystery, it's sitting in plain view, distorted by layers of belief, fear, and inherited conclusion. And until those layers are named, truth cannot land. Not even the most sacred truth can be felt while illusion stands at the gates, dressed up as identity, urgency, logic. So, before we journey inward, I invite you to like and subscribe, but only if it truly resonates with your soul. Because what you're about to encounter is not soothing, it is not poetic, it is not what most call inspirational. This is spiritual clarity that begins by burning away false seeing. And in the beginning, that burn is not gentle. True vision never begins with the eyes. It begins with a cracking, a disruption. A moment when the thought, "I know what's happening," is broken wide open by the quiet thunder of, "Maybe I don't." Not just about a situation, but about everything. And that moment, scary as it may seem, is holy. Because it is the moment the false veil starts to loosen. You may have felt it, that strange numbness when the old story stops working, when your usual reactions fall flat, when the righteous anger, the practiced pain, the spiritual vocabulary, all of it feels hollow. That moment doesn't mean you've lost your way, it means the inner eyes are opening, not to new knowledge, but to the end of illusion. The rising of right-seeing does not announce itself with fanfare. It does not flash through you like fireworks. It arrives like an ache, a knowing that something in the way you've been interpreting life is off. You feel the disconnect in the way your body tightens when you speak words that don't come from truth. You feel it when you catch yourself looping in a mental spiral you've spun 100 times before and realize, this is not real, this is remembered. That's where seeing begins, not with revelation, but with the courage to admit your current perception is clouded. You were conditioned to confuse noise for vision. You were handed a worldview, told it was universal, and trained to filter every experience through it. You inherited fears you never questioned, beliefs that never served you, judgments that felt like instincts, and yet you lived them as truth, because to the unconscious mind, repetition equals reality. But the moment right-seeing begins, that lie breaks. You stop trusting the voice in your head just because it sounds familiar. You start noticing how fast your mind concludes, how quickly it explains, and how often it does so to avoid truth, not to face it. This is the first flicker of Christ consciousness, not religious belief, not moral high ground, but the capacity to perceive rightly. And the moment it begins to rise, you feel it in your bones. Things you used to react to now feel oddly distant. Opinions that used to define you begin to dissolve. And underneath it all, a quiet space starts to open. At first, that space feels empty. But it's not. It's clear. And clarity, when you've lived through distortion, can feel like death. The death of story. The death of knowing. The death of what you thought you had to be. That's why this awakening is so often misunderstood. It doesn't begin with ecstasy. It begins with the collapse of illusion. And collapse, even when it is sacred, still feels like collapse. You may grieve not because something real is lost, but because the scaffolding that held your self-concept in place has begun to crumble. You may feel unanchored not because truth has failed you, but because the false anchor no longer holds. Let it go. Let the unlearning begin. Right-seeing does not rush in. It unfolds. It settles. It expands only as much as your willingness allows. It doesn't ask you to become spiritual. It asks you to become willing to see. Willing to notice where you're defending, where you're filtering, where you're still arguing with what island. The mind does not like this process. It prefers drama. It prefers contrast. But right-seeing doesn't need to argue. It doesn't panic. It doesn't exaggerate. It's simply island clear, clean, unburdened by narrative. And you know it when it comes. Not because it overwhelms, but because it ends the conflict without having to win it. So, if you're here, feeling like something inside you is disassembling, something in you no longer reacts the way it used to, something in you is whispering, there must be a better way. You are not lost. You are awakening. Right seeing is rising. Let it rise. Christ is not a figure to worship from afar. Christ is a pattern and internal design for right seeing, seated into every consciousness but rarely activated. If you reduce it to a historical name or a mystical abstraction, you miss the doorway entirely. Christ is not a doctrine. It is the architecture of clarity buried within the fog of human perception. When Emmet Fox spoke of Christ, he did not speak of a personality. He spoke of a principle. The Christ principle is the universal pattern through which truth enters consciousness, dispersing illusion, burning off projection, and anchoring the soul in reality, not fantasy, not sentiment, not self-image, reality. To understand Christ rightly is to understand that truth cannot be separated from how you see. The pattern of Christ doesn't fix your life. It corrects your perception. And once perception shifts, life organizes itself around the new seeing. This is not metaphor. It is mechanics. Every thought you have is part of a larger pattern. When you are in ego patterns rooted in defense, fear, and judgment, your thoughts interpret reality as a battlefield. You begin every day with the assumption that something must be won, something must be protected, something must be overcome. You see the world not as it is, but as your past has taught you to expect. But when the Christ pattern begins to take hold, that internal lens changes. You are no longer interpreting life through trauma or culture or reaction. You begin seeing it through law, through order, through presence. And everything begins to look unfamiliar not because the world has changed, but because you are no longer reading it through the distortion of old conclusions. This shift doesn't come by trying harder. You cannot earn it. You cannot manufacture it with affirmations or spiritual performance. You can only become willing to see differently, willing to yield the lens that has made you right but kept you bound. And that willingness is everything. Because the Christ pattern does not attach to pain. It sees it, but does not identify with it. It acknowledges fear, but does not interpret through it. And most of all, it refuses to build identity out of what has happened to you. This refusal is not cruelty, it is liberation. You are not what has happened to you. You are what you see through. And until that seeing shifts, you will repeat the same spiritual cycle under new language, new books, new teachers. You will have new insights, but the same old filters, and nothing really changes. That is why this pattern must rise, not conceptually, but functionally. It must rise in your decision-making, in how you respond when no one's watching, in the stories you no longer entertain in your inner dialogue, in the authority you begin to place, not on appearances, but on deeper knowing. Christ consciousness is not passive. It is not soft-focus mysticism. It is precise. It is active. It sees exactly what is happening, but without distortion, without collapse, without projection. It names things with clarity, but without judgment. It walks into chaos and does not become it. When you begin living from this pattern, people around you will notice, but they won't always understand. You'll seem quieter, but deeper, more direct, less performative. Your energy won't spike and crash. Your presence won't require validation. And most of all, you'll start to feel less reactive, but more awake. This is not detachment. It is right engagement. You're not turning away from life. You're finally seeing it without the fog of illusion. You'll start noticing how much of your old suffering was interpretation, not event. How much of your fear was narrative, not fact. How often your anger was an echo, not a message. And that noticing isn't just insight, it is entrance. The moment you notice clearly, the Christ pattern begins to settle in. Not because you are becoming more spiritual, but because you are becoming more true. This pattern does not scream. It does not demand. It does not compete with the noise in your head. It waits. And the moment you make space by surrendering your habitual lens, it arrives like a quiet flame. Not to light your path, but to become the eyes that see it. And once that fire rises, you can never return to blindness. You may forget. You may fall into old rhythms. But something in you will remember what clear seeing feels like. And that memory is not mental, it is vibrational. A recognition in the bones. Christ is not coming from outside. Christ is arising within. As a lens. As a rhythm. As the end of distortion, let it rise. Illusion rarely announces itself. It doesn't barge in, dramatic and obvious. It drifts. It drips. It becomes familiar. And then it calls itself truth, not with violence, but with repetition. By the time you start questioning your perception, illusion has already made itself a home. It's in how you explain your life to yourself. It's in the tones you accept without noticing. It's in the meanings you assign before anything has even happened. Most people don't live in reality. They live in reaction. They navigate not from what is, but from what they fear will be. And the tragedy is, they don't even know they're doing it. Because the patterns of illusion are disguised as instinct, as common sense, as identity. You might think you see clearly, but if your seeing is shaped by defense, by trauma, by control mechanisms inherited from culture or childhood, then you are not seeing. You are filtering. And the filter is not neutral. It tells you who to be, what to expect, how others will treat you, what's safe and what's threatening. And most of all, it tells you what's possible, not based on law, but on memory. This is the core of illusion. It makes the past the lens through which you see the present. Fox spoke to this without dramatics. He simply pointed out that most people never confront the mechanism through which they interpret. They try to think better thoughts, but the filter remains. They chant affirmations over beliefs that never changed. They read truth but see through distortion and then wonder why transformation doesn't come. Illusion, once normalized, feels like logic. It doesn't scream, "I'm lying." It whispers, "This is just how it island." And because the voice is quiet, familiar, embedded, you follow it without even hearing it speak. Until something breaks. Maybe you begin to feel trapped in a loop. Not a big failure. Just a low-grade pattern that repeats different faces, same dynamic, different jobs, same ache, different goals, same anxiety. That repetition is your signal. Not that something's wrong, but that something is unreal. Because truth does not loop. Truth flows. Illusion loops. Illusion returns in circles, disguised as new experience. But if the emotion, the behavior, the collapse is the same, illusion is running the show. And right seeing, it begins not with insight, but with confrontation. Not dramatic confrontation with others. Quiet confrontation with the thoughts that shape your world. You begin to ask not as a performance, but as a personal reckoning, what if what I believe is true isn't? What if my story of rejection is not reality, but a pattern of interpretation? What if my assumptions about others are reflections of my own unhealed vision? What if the thing I've been guarding against doesn't even exist the way I think it does? These questions are not rhetorical. They are piercing. They shake you, and they are the door. Because the moment you stop defending your interpretation, you open space for actual truth to enter. And that truth doesn't need to argue with illusion. It just disperses it, like light cuts fog. Like presence stills noise. Like love undoes fear, not by fighting, but by existing. The illusion that binds you most is usually the one you're most fluent in. The one that helped you survive. The one you used to get approval, to stay safe, to stay needed. It feels natural, which is why the beginning of real clarity always feels foreign. Not because it's not yours, but because it's not what you're used to. Right seeing is not familiar at first, but it is true. And when you taste it, even for a moment, it ruins your tolerance for illusion. You may still fall back into it, but it will no longer feel right. The story won't land the same, the defense won't satisfy. The old justifications will sound thin in your own ears. And that's not failure, that's progress. You don't stop illusion in one decision. You outgrow it by returning again and again to the frequency of truth. Not by force, by refusal. You refuse to entertain thought that loops. You refuse to follow fear that's dressed up as discernment. You refuse to call your coping mechanisms wisdom. This isn't about self-judgment, it's about self-honesty. Because, until you name illusion for what it is, familiarity, not truth, you will mistake the known for the good, the repeated for the real, the remembered for the present. And in that confusion, you will suffer. But once the light of Christ pattern begins to rise in your awareness, that suffering becomes intolerable. Not because it grows, but because you awaken. An awakened vision will not let you live in blindness and call it safety. So let the illusion crack. Let the familiarity fail. Let the voice that says, "This is just how I am," go quiet. Because right seeing is rising, and what it reveals is not new. It's what has always been true, underneath the fog. The most dangerous illusion is the one you've built into your name. It speaks in your own voice. It remembers your past perfectly. It feels like home not because it's real, but because you've worn it for so long. This is the false self, the ego, not as arrogance or vanity, but as the composite mask of strategies, fears, and inherited definitions. And if you never question it, it becomes you. But it's not you. It is the lie that feels like you. It's subtle. It doesn't sabotage with force. It protects you in a way that slowly imprisons you. It tells you, don't say that, don't need that, don't risk that. And it calls that wisdom. It tells you who you need to be loved, to be safe, to belong. And you believe it not because it speaks truth, but because it mimics survival. This false self is not evil. It's adaptive. It was built in the dark corners of pain and misunderstanding. It formed when you were too young to name your feelings, too desperate to feel held, too uncertain to separate opinion from essence. And in that space, the mask began to harden. You began to think it was your personality. Your, "I'm just that way." Your, "This is how I function." But it's not. It's how you copied, how you repeated, how you adapted to what your early environment made necessary. And no one told you it was temporary, so you carried it forward. Into relationships, into work, into your voice, until the weight of it became so normal, you forgot you were carrying anything at all. This is the sink. The moment when you look at your life and feel that cold hollowness, not from failure, but from familiarity that no longer resonates. The people still approve. The world still applauds. But inside, something doesn't match. Something is deadening. That feeling is not weakness. It's not a sign you've lost your path. It's a sign that the illusion you've called me is beginning to crumble under the weight of light. Because the Christ pattern, once active in consciousness, refuses to cooperate with false identity. Not through violence, but through non-resonance. You'll find yourself unable to perform old roles. Your reactions won't arrive on time. You'll be halfway through a sentence and realize you don't believe what you're saying. You'll sit in conversations and feel like a ghost. This is not depression, it's disidentification. The lie that feels like you is losing its grip. And it hurts. Because ego, even when it's small and scared, is known. It has rules. It has patterns. It has meaning. Without it, you feel suspended, undefined. That's the break, where the old self stops working, but the new self hasn't emerged. You feel like you've lost your language, like you can't go back, but you're not sure what forward means yet. You question everything, not from doubt, but from the sacred clarity that says, "I can't pretend anymore." Fox knew this space well. He spoke often of the tension between the personal self and the Christ within, that they are not enemies, but they cannot coexist in authority. One will have to yield. And that yielding is not an instant victory. It's a sequence of choices, 1,000 micro-deaths. Each time you choose to speak with honesty instead of habit. Each time you sit in discomfort instead of running to fix it. Each time you choose stillness over explanation, truth over likability, alignment over approval. In those choices, the false self begins to fade. Not in a burst, but in a slow, clean dissolve. And what emerges is not a better version of you. It's not an upgrade. It's not a brand. It's you without a filter, without the bend, without the projection. At first, this true self feels exposed, vulnerable, raw, because it doesn't know how to perform. It doesn't have practiced lines. It doesn't know who to impress. It only knows how to be. And in a world that rewards role-playing, that can feel like a disadvantage. But you will start to notice something else. Your body relaxes. Your voice changes. You feel quieter, but clearer. Less urgent, more rooted. Not numb, not passive present. Because illusion tenses the system. It demands effort to maintain. But truth rests. It moves cleanly, speaks simply, sees rightly. And that's the gift of this collapse. You are not becoming someone else. You are ceasing to perform who you never were. And when that performance ends, right seeing begins not just in your mind, but in your being. You begin to experience life, not through defense, but through directness. Not through memory, but through presence. That's the awakening. Not to something new, but to something real. The truth of what you are was never lost. Only masked. Let the mask fall. Right seeing doesn't feel like illumination at first. It feels like disruption. It interrupts the flow of your old interpretation and replaces it with something you can't quite categorize. You don't yet have words for it, because it doesn't arrive through language. It arrives through interference. It interrupts the rhythm of your internal scripting, and that interruption feels at first like loss. Not because you're losing anything real, but because you're losing the security of being sure. The shock of clear perception is never what people imagine. They expect euphoria, a moment of knowing, of divine warmth, of cosmic permission. But real clarity rarely grants that comfort on arrival. It confronts first. It deconstructs before it steadies. Because clarity is not a gift, it's a reckoning. You suddenly see what you used to justify. You hear what you've been saying for years and it sounds false. You watch yourself act out old patterns, and you can't pretend not to notice. The familiar becomes unbearable, not because it changed, but because you did. This is the shock. Not a bolt from heaven, but a dissonance in the soul. You're in the middle of your life, your real life, the one you built with effort and identity, and yet you feel as though none of it is truly yours. Not because it was wrong, but because it was filtered, formed through vision you no longer trust. The shock comes because seeing clearly is not gentle, it's precise. It cuts, not violently, but accurately, like a scalpel removing what doesn't belong. You don't bleed, but you tremble, because something inside you is being restructured not through belief, but through direct perception. And perception leaves no hiding place. You can't unsee the moment you realize your control mechanisms are built on fear. You can't ignore it when you witness yourself bending your truth to keep comfort intact. You can't go back to autopilot when you've tasted the discomfort of real awareness. Fox spoke of this trembling moment as necessary, not because God demands suffering, but because the false self must be disoriented before it can be displaced. It must experience collapse not dramatic, but deliberate. Not in public, but in your most private thoughts. The thoughts you think no one hears, the beliefs you never even voiced, the stories you told yourself just to get through the day. All of them lose weight. You look at your reactions and see they were rehearsals. You watch your anxiety and recognize it has no anchor in present truth. You remember things you clung to for years and realize they held no meaning apart from your story. And at first, it's destabilizing. Because illusion is cozy. It's built to feel like structure. Even if it hurts, it's predictable. And we will choose familiar suffering over unknown clarity until the pain of pretending outweighs the fear of change. This is the moment of breakage. Not chaos. Correction. Right seeing corrects. It straightens. It doesn't scold, but it will not allow you to continue misperceiving and call it love, or loyalty, or safety. It asks for alignment. Not all at once, but right now, wherever you stand. That's why it hurts. Not because it's wrong, but because it's real. And reality has texture. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't soften, but it does heal. Because clarity doesn't need force, it only needs a place to land. You don't have to overhaul your life to align with it. You simply have to stop resisting what you already know. And that knowing is often quiet. It rises in a breath, a pause before a reaction, a tension in your chest when you're about to say something you no longer believe, a weariness in your voice when you try to explain a pattern you've outgrown, a stillness that follows truth, even when it's inconvenient. The shock is in noticing that you've been asleep, that you've been playing a role, that your spiritual language became a costume, that your logic was rooted in fear, that your strength was sometimes just suppression, and that your hope was built on outcomes, not on presence. But what comes after that shock is power. Not noisy power, not performative certainty, but steady, rooted knowing. The kind that doesn't flinch when questioned, the kind that no longer asks for permission to exist, the kind that stops proving and starts inhabiting. Because right-seeing doesn't need validation. It knows what it knows. And once it rises in you, the shock fades not because the world changes, but because you no longer read it the same way. You stop fearing what used to overwhelm you. You stop defending what never needed protection. You stop identifying with the version of you that needed illusion to survive. You begin to trust the quiet clarity that now pulses beneath your skin. And it will guide you, even when no one else sees what you see. Every thought you think opens or closes a gate, not metaphorically but energetically. It sets the tone of your awareness, the flavor of your perception, and the path of your action. Thought isn't just commentary, it's a gatekeeper. And if you don't become conscious of who's standing at the gate, you will mistake every reaction, every internal narrative, every inherited assumption as truth. This is where most perception becomes corrupted not by overt lies, but by unchecked filters. You walk through your day listening to thought without questioning its authorship. You hear, "This always happens," or "They're probably judging me," or "I'm not ready yet." And you respond not with discernment, but with agreement. That agreement is subtle. You don't shout yes to the lie. You simply act from it. You adjust your posture. You shrink your expression. You delay your movement. And the gatekeeper wins. Not because it was strong, but because it was unopposed. Thought, unchecked, becomes law. Not universal law, but personal law. And those private laws shape your entire field of experience. They determine what you notice, how you react, what you allow, what you assume. And until those laws are examined, they remain in place, defending illusions you no longer believe. This is the quiet tragedy. That truth often tries to reach you but gets stopped at the gate. Because the gate is locked by habit, guarded by emotion, framed by memory. So even when light arrives, even when the Christ pattern nudges your awareness into presence, the old gatekeeper responds first. It labels the light as unfamiliar. And if you aren't vigilant, unfamiliar equals unsafe. So the moment passes, and you stay in the loop, until the pattern breaks. And when it does, the break doesn't come with drama. It comes with pause. That rare second when you notice what you're thinking and something inside whispers, "Is this even real?" You don't need an answer. The question alone weakens the gate. You begin to see that thought is not a mirror, it's a lens, and that lens can be cleaned. Not by replacing one belief with another, but by watching. Thought loses power in the presence of observation. Not judgmental analysis, pure, quiet awareness. That awareness is not passive, it's transformational. Because the moment you watch a thought without identifying with it, you create space. And in that space, Christ perception begins to rise. Not as a flash of insight, but as a slow turning away from reaction toward truth. This is the rise. When you begin to sense that not every thought deserves belief. When you start to notice which inner voices lead to peace and which lead to contraction. When you catch yourself mid-story and no longer feel obligated to finish the sentence. When your inner world begins to loosen. But as that space opens, something else happens. You feel the grip of old thought patterns tightening, trying to reclaim ground. They speak with more urgency. They wrap themselves in logic. They call themselves intuition. They remind you of past evidence. And suddenly, you're back in the noise. This is the sink, not a failure. Just the tug of the familiar, the gravitational pull of a system that hasn't fully recalibrated. You notice your body responding, shoulders tense, breath short, thoughts spinning. You're being pulled toward reaction, not because it's truth, but because it's known. And that's the moment. The gate is visible. You see it. You see the thought. You feel the emotion. You watch the pattern reaching for the same old outcome. And you pause, not to fight, not to fix, but to choose differently. That pause is sacred. It is the space where transformation actually happens not in ideas, but in practice. You interrupt the mechanism. You stop the gate from slamming shut. You let truth stand there a second longer. And maybe this time you open the door. This is the break. The moment you stop treating thought as authority. The moment you refuse to obey a fear simply because it's eloquent. The moment you stop negotiating with doubt and start moving anyway. That's when Christ perception takes ground, not as theory, but as lived function. It doesn't mean the old thoughts stop coming, but it means they don't own the gate anymore. They don't get the final say. They don't walk in without inspection. And slowly, the gate begins to shift. It becomes transparent, porous, a place of discernment, not reaction. You begin to think on purpose. You begin to notice what supports clarity and what seduces you into loops. You hold a standard not to be pure, but to be available to reality as an island. Because truth does not scream to be heard. It waits at the threshold, not trying to convince you, just waiting for space. Let it in. The Christ mind doesn't drift. It doesn't wonder or wander. It doesn't guess. When it sees clean. And this is where most people flinch, because clarity, when it arrives through the Christ pattern, is not casual. It's not vague. It's not wrapped in emotional softness to make it more digestible. It is precise. It names what island. It recognizes what isn't. It doesn't add story. It doesn't subtract responsibility. It doesn't delay action to avoid discomfort. This kind of seeing doesn't require permission, and it doesn't seek applause. It simply knows. And in that knowing, it cuts through layers that sentimental spirituality prefers to keep intact. You may have noticed this already, the split between spiritual language that soothes and spiritual truth that slices. One is emotional relief, the other is real transformation. And only one will carry you forward when your soul refuses to keep repeating. Right seeing is not an accessory to personality. It's not something to decorate your identity. It's not here to confirm your worldview. It's here to replace it. And that replacement begins with recognizing that the Christ mind doesn't move in ambiguity. It moves in order, divine order, mental clarity, emotional maturity, discernment that doesn't collapse into guilt just because it's misunderstood. It feels different in the body. When you're seeing through Christ, your nervous system slows. Not because nothing is happening, but because your system is no longer burning fuel on reaction. You are not bracing. You are not bending. You are simply present and aware. This is the rise. You begin to realize that confusion isn't spiritual. Sentimentality isn't sacred. Constant emotion isn't evidence of depth. Sometimes, the most spiritual thing you can do is name something clearly and act accordingly. No ritual, no performance, no need to explain. And that clarity? It will threaten the part of you still addicted to chaos. Because the ego knows how to operate in fog. It knows how to defend, delay, dramatize. But once you start living from precision, that mechanism starts to panic. It says things like, "You're being cold, you're overcorrecting, you're going too far." Not because it's true, but because the fog is lifting and the ego has nowhere to hide. This is the sink. When clarity feels cruel, when directness feels like loss, when the act of seeing cleanly feels like a betrayal of your former self, you may question your softness. You may feel distant from those who are still looping in the language you once used. You may miss the warmth of not knowing. But don't mistake discomfort for error. This is the pain of recalibration. You're shedding not your heart, but your confusion. And confusion, for many, has been home. It's been the shield, the escape route, the justification for staying stuck. To lose that confusion is to lose a sense of self. And for a moment, it will feel like emptiness. But what feels empty is actually clear. Space. Space no longer jammed with explanations and entanglements. Space now available for clean movement, clean vision, clean action. That's the break. The moment you stop trying to dress truth in acceptable language. The moment you stop watering down your insight so it fits the emotional expectation of others. The moment you stop compromising clarity just to keep from being alone in it. Christ's perception doesn't bend to opinion. It doesn't apologize for its sharpness. It carries love in the form of truth, not indulgence. And that kind of love liberates not by making you feel better, but by making you real. You may lose some things here. You may lose dynamics that only function through your uncertainty. You may lose patterns that fed on your doubt. You may lose a version of you that was more digestible, more compliant, more confused, more agreeable. Let that version go. Because right seeing is not a new script. It's the absence of scripting. It's not about having better answers. It's about no longer asking from distortion. It's not about spiritual comfort. It's about spiritual accuracy. This is where your strength grows. Quietly, not through assertion, but through alignment. You start to speak differently. Fewer words. Cleaner delivery. You stop needing to justify clarity, and you begin to live it. And when others ask how, you don't teach it with steps. You embody it with steadiness. You walk in precision without pressure. You become safe not because you're soft, but because you're solid. That solidity is not stoic. It's not rigid. It's the steadiness of someone who no longer depends on fog to function. Someone who has let the Christ mind rise to the surface and trusts it to lead. This is the real work, not emotional performance, not mystical drama, just vision clear, grounded, lived. Let it deepen. Sentiment is not spirituality, it's a substitute. It mimics warmth, but doesn't carry clarity. It offers comfort, but not change. It sings softly when your world aches, but never tells you where the ache is coming from. And while it may soothe the heart for a moment, it never frees the mind. That work belongs to something higher, something sharper, something like Christ consciousness. The false layers of spiritual feeling are often the last illusions to go. They are delicate, they seem kind, they look like peace, but underneath their softness lives avoidance. Behind the poetic language, the trust the process, cliches, the compulsive gratitude, there's a refusal to name what must be seen, and where things are not seen, truth cannot enter. The Christ mind does not traffic in sentiment. It brings stillness, not softness. It brings cleanness, not comfort. It cuts through the fog that emotionalized spirituality often protects. And that cut, though precise and liberating, feels to the untrained system like loss. You may have felt it. That moment when the language you used to lean on becomes hollow, when the phrases that once felt powerful feel like placeholders, when your own voice starts to sound like you're trying to convince yourself. That moment is sacred, because it marks the beginning of the end of sentimental spirituality. It is the rise of real perception. But perception, when stripped of decoration, doesn't flatter. It doesn't give you stories to post. It doesn't hand you hashtags. It simply holds up a mirror and waits, and most people can't look. Not for long. Because the mirror doesn't show failure. It shows falseness. Not in a condemning way, in a precise surgical way. It shows the moments you knew and chose not to act. The relationships you maintained because they validated your image. The beliefs you defended because they made you feel right even when they kept you small. This is the rise. The moment when clarity doesn't come with tears or music, it just arrives. Still, sharp, steady. And in that moment, You feel everything the sentimental lens tried to buffer, the grief of how long you've worn a mask, the quiet guilt of the patterns you've upheld, the heartbreak of who you became in order to survive. But it's not punishment, it's permission. To stop performing, to stop sugarcoating your knowing, to stop dressing your truth in palatable language. Christ doesn't coddle, Christ clears. This is where many retreat. They say things like, "I need time to process," or "I'm just sitting with it." But they aren't sitting, they're circling. Because sitting with truth doesn't prolong pain. It ends loops. It strips away the sentiment that keeps them in place. This is the sink, where your old comforts don't work, where spiritual bypass is exposed, where positivity feels shallow and holding space becomes another form of enabling. You stand at the edge of your own avoidance and realize there's nowhere left to go but through. And when you walk through, not in theory, but in living contact, you feel something else break. Not like a fall, like a shedding. The heaviness lifts. The pretense dissolves. You don't feel light because you were given answers. You feel light because you stopped protecting the lie. The system that needed sentiment to survive no longer governs your movement. This is the break, where presence replaces performance, where clean silence speaks louder than 1,000 insights, where you stop asking, "What should I feel?" and begin living from what is, whether or not it feels good. Because spiritual maturity doesn't chase feeling. It anchors in awareness. It lets Christ light illuminate everything, even the parts you've wrapped in poetry and called healing, especially those parts. From here, you begin to see again, not through haze, but through order. Not through story, but through structure. Not with your heart reaching for safety, but with your spirit resting in what's real. And what's real? That you are not here to manage perception. You are here to embody truth. That embodiment has weight, gravity, precision. It's not loud, it's not emotional, but it radiates in your words, your posture, your silence. Let the sentiment fall away. Let clarity take its place. There is a kind of power that arrives only when you stop needing to be understood. It doesn't bark. It doesn't retreat. It doesn't explain itself. It simply sees, and in the act of seeing, it reorders everything around it. This is not force. It's not dominance. It is the quiet, unwavering current of right-seeing clarity that does not react. You may have been taught that to be aware is to be vigilant, to be spiritually mature is to be emotionally expressive, to be present is to constantly analyze what you feel. But clarity doesn't do any of those things. It watches, it tracks, it moves when necessary, and remains still when not. This is where the Christ mind begins to stabilize, in the choice to see without defending, to be fully present without performing presence, to stand inside discomfort without collapsing into it or rescuing others from their own. That choice may feel unnatural at first, because for so long, your sight was tethered to reaction. You believed awareness had to come with opinion, that seeing clearly required you to do something, that empathy meant absorbing, and that truth had to be softened to preserve connection. But when perception aligns with the Christ pattern, reaction no longer feels holy. It feels excessive, wasteful. You begin to feel it in your nervous system. The difference between clarity and emotional indulgence. The difference between discernment and judgment. Between compassion and rescuing. And for the first time, you begin to notice how much of your energy was spent trying to manage what you saw instead of letting it be. This is the rise. When a situation unfolds, and instead of tensing, explaining, performing, or internalizing, you observe. You don't rush to interpret. You don't armor up. You don't spiritualize your discomfort. You simply let the truth rise as it is, without building an emotional fortress around it. That kind of neutrality is misunderstood. Some will say you've become cold. Others may say you've changed. And they're right. But what they don't see is the cost you've paid to arrive at this steadiness, the work it took to unwind the need to react, the years you spent performing empathy when your system was overloaded, the quiet guilt you carried every time you didn't show up in the way people expected. This is the sink. Because clarity, at first, isolates. You no longer participate in emotional choreography. You stop nodding to dynamics you no longer believe in. You say less. You interfere less. You lose the urge to fix everything that feels uncomfortable. And in that space, you may feel disconnected. Not because you've withdrawn, but because you've stopped merging. You're not blending to belong anymore. You're not absorbing others' pain as a proxy for love. You're not using reactivity as proof that you care. So the noise around you may increase. Others may try to pull you back into the old dance. They'll speak with more volume. They'll question your silence. They'll name your steadiness as apathy, because their world still runs on reactivity. But your soul knows the difference. You feel the shift. You feel it when your thoughts stay clear, even in the middle of tension, when your emotions rise but don't possess you, when your truth becomes a lens, not a weapon. This is the break, where clarity becomes internal law, no longer something you visit in meditation, but something you live in traffic, at dinner, during conflict, inside silence. You begin to walk through your life with a new kind of stillness, the kind that's rooted in knowing, the kind that doesn't ask for certainty, but doesn't shake under pressure, the kind that stops bracing for attack, because nothing in you is attacking yourself anymore. When you see without reacting, you begin to inhabit peace, not as a posture, but as a property of awareness. And from that awareness, you speak differently. You engage more selectively. You become a safe place not because you absorb, but because you anchor. And that anchoring? That's what changes rooms. Not your arguments, not your volume, not your spiritual insight. Your energy, stabilized in truth, held without reaction, that's what shifts the field. So the next time your instinct wants to leap, wants to fix, wants to correct, pause. Not because you're suppressing, but because you're watching. Because you've trained your awareness to see before it speaks, to listen before it explains, to hold before it moves. This is the clarity you've been seeking. Let it move you quietly. There's a moment when you realize your awareness can watch itself. When you don't just think, you observe the one thinking. You don't just react, you witness the impulse to react. This is not detachment. It's not distance. It's the beginning of sovereignty, the awakening of the eye that watches the watcher. This level of seeing is not mystical. It's structural. It means the center of gravity shifts. You're no longer inside the noise. You're conscious of it, but not governed by it. You feel the old stories surface, but they don't pull you under. The voice that once narrated your reality with urgency and emotion now sounds quieter, less convincing, less relevant. This is not transcendence. You haven't floated away. You're more here than ever. But something in you has stepped back, not in retreat, but in reference. You're referencing truth, not history. You're letting the Christ mind view the moment, rather than allowing the conditioned mind to run the moment. Fox hinted at this capacity often. He called it bringing the Christ into consciousness. Not as an event, but as a repositioning. You are no longer centered in the fluctuating self-image. You are centered in clarity itself. That clarity watches. It doesn't rush. It doesn't dramatize. And because it doesn't need to be right, it sees what is not what it wishes or fears. This is the rise. You begin to trust that space inside you, the one that doesn't panic, the one that doesn't flinch when a sharp comment lands or a plan fails, the one that doesn't race to fix, validate, or restore your image. You find yourself pausing not because you're unsure, but because you don't need to prove anything. That pause isn't passivity. It's intelligence. It's perception moving with exactness. The Christ mind doesn't blurt. It doesn't collapse into performance. It moves after it sees. And when it sees the whole without the filter of your past, your pain, your programming. But that pause also brings with it an ache. This is the sink. Because when you begin to live from the observer, you also begin to feel everything your reactivity once shielded you from. The silence beneath the noise, the longing beneath the achievement, the isolation beneath the mask. You start to notice that the version of you others knew was never fully present, that even your greatest moments of connection were filtered through self-consciousness, that every conversation had a layer of calculation, that every smile had a trace of survival in it. And now, it doesn't. Now you stand in a room and feel how much space there island. You walk through a moment and sense how few words are actually needed. You realize how much of your life has been spent trying to explain what could have simply been lived. This is the break. When the internal commentary begins to dissolve, when the need to narrate your experience to yourself fades, when you no longer need to know who you are in every moment because you've stopped identifying with the one asking the question. You don't disappear. You recenter. The self that once needed validation no longer runs the show. The self that once clung to performance, identity, defense, it relaxes. It steps aside. And what remains is a deeper stillness, a sharper presence, an eye that doesn't blink. From this place, your choices begin to change, not because you try harder, but because they arise from a different reference point. You stop asking, "What do I need to do to be okay?" and begin responding from what is already true. You stop managing the image. You start honoring the moment. You stop defending the past. You start inhabiting the present. You stop seeking meaning. You start being the meaning. And as this eye within you opens wider, you'll notice something radical. You can be fully human, with flaws, confusion, and grief, and still remain centered in light. You no longer chase purity. You embody integrity, not as perfection, but as alignment with truth. This eye, the watcher of the watcher, is not cold, it's not robotic, it's not emotionless. It is steady, and its steadiness creates safety, not just for you, but for others. People begin to trust your presence, even if they don't understand it. You speak less, you see more, you guide without trying. Because the most powerful presence in any room is not the loudest, it's the clearest. And clarity doesn't look away. Let the eye open. There comes a shift where you stop asking for relief and start anchoring in reality. Not the reality of circumstance which changes, but the deeper, silent reality of what is always true. That truth isn't found in the swirl of emotions or the narrative of progress. It's discovered in stillness, in the space where you no longer need the moment to change for you to remain grounded. And this shift, though subtle, marks the difference between spiritual appetite and spiritual maturity. Most people come to truth looking for escape, a way out of pain, a fix for confusion, a balm for their longing. And at first, that's fine. It's how many begin. But as long as you expect truth to feel good, you will reject it every time it doesn't. Because truth doesn't obey emotion. It doesn't soften itself to preserve your mood. It just island. And when it arrives, it asks only one question. Will you align, even if it costs you comfort? This is the rise. The point at which you stop trying to make truth palatable and begin making yourself available to its order. You notice when your nervous system contracts around certain insights. You feel how resistance clings to your throat just before you speak. You realize how long you've tried to fit truth into your current way of life instead of letting it rebuild the way you live. In this place, something deeper begins to take shape. Not a new belief, but a kind of interior resolve. You're not chasing answers anymore. You're not performing depth. You're not rearranging the furniture of your psyche to appear enlightened. You're simply settling into what is and what has always been. And here comes the sink. Because this kind of stillness, true stillness, reveals just how noisy your search has been. You start to see that even your highest questions were built on the assumption that something is missing, that you needed to arrive, that you needed to improve, that your life needed to mean something before it could be lived fully. That was the illusion. That you needed a story to be valid. Now, with right seeing active, the story collapses. And the emptiness that follows isn't hollow, it's clear, like a room finally cleaned out after years of hoarding meaning. You stand in it, unsure what to bring back in. And the temptation will be to decorate again, reach for spiritual ideas, emotional narratives, mystical images. But this is the break. The part where you stop decorating consciousness and let it remain bare, where you don't rush to fill the space, where you let the absence of meaning become the presence of reality. No slogans, no affirmations, just the clean, unnarrated clarity of now. In this space, truth begins to move, not as thought, but as function. You don't think, I am peace. You just don't react. You don't rehearse. I choose presence. You're already present. The structure of awareness becomes your operating system, not your aspiration. This shift changes your relationship with experience. You no longer analyze your every feeling to extract a lesson. You no longer ask, what is the universe trying to show me? Every time life moves. You don't need meaning to make you feel safe. You are safe because you are seated in what is not in the stories you build to survive it. That's the essence of Christ mind. Not a story, not an image, not a system of belief, a structure of perception. A reference point rooted in clarity so deep, it no longer requires drama to validate its depth. You begin to trust what doesn't move, not because it promises outcomes, but because it never lied. That stillness inside you, that constant awareness, it has watched your entire life. Every peak, every collapse, every reinvention, every confession, every return. And it never flinched, never defended, never needed proof. It just watched patiently, quietly, cleanly. And now, you live from it. Let that be enough. There is a moment when you no longer ask for more light, because you finally understand you are not the source of it. You are not the fire, you are the window. And your only task now is to become transparent enough for that light to shine through, unbent and unburdened. This is where the spiritual journey ceases to be about acquisition. No more seeking, no more collecting, no more refining your self-image through books and practices and quotes. At this depth, you don't need more. You need less. Less resistance, less story, less personal identification with what never belonged to you in the first place. Transparency is not absence, it's alignment. It means no longer using your personality to buffer your perception, no longer filtering what comes through you for the sake of being accepted, admired, or understood. It means stepping aside not out of self-denial, but out of self-recognition. Because once you stop confusing your filters for your essence, truth can flow without friction. This is the rise. You start to feel the difference between effort and availability. You used to try to project clarity to sound wise, to seem spiritual, to offer insight. Now it just moves. The words arrive clean, without decoration. The presence holds steady, even when silence is the only gift. And when the light moves through you like that, without performance, something extraordinary happens. You disappear, and yet you are more fully yourself than ever before. Because the self you once defended was the one blocking the transmission. And now, with the filters gone, there's nothing to prove, only something to transmit. You become a vessel not in mystical abstraction, but in grounded function. You walk into a room and clarity enters with you. You speak and people hear more than the words. You listen and others feel seen not because you try, but because you're not in the way. This is the sync. Because that disappearance of effort also reveals how much of your previous presence was tangled in self-concern. You feel the sharp ache of recognizing that your service was sometimes performance, that your helpfulness was often entangled with ego, that your love, however sincere, still carried the scent of needing to be needed. And as those realizations land, you don't shame yourself. You don't spiral. You watch. You feel the layers of identity peel back, not in force, but in surrender. You stop trying to be the one who understands, the one who holds space, the one who transforms others, and you become empty enough to be used by truth, by love, by light. This is the break. You stop trying to shine. You let yourself be lit. You walk through your life with the inner posture of less me, more light, not in words, not as philosophy, but as the atmosphere of your being. You don't decorate the divine. You don't brand the sacred. You just move cleanly, precisely, honestly, and in doing so, you become the most radiant thing in the room without even knowing it. Because transparency is magnetic. Not in the way of personality, but in the way of resonance. People feel you without explanation. They lean in without knowing why. They feel safe not because you fix them, but because your presence doesn't need anything from them. This is the power of becoming transparent to light. It's not about being passive. It's about being clear. Clean intention, clean speech, clean service, no hooks. No echoes of, "Look at me," just a window letting truth shine through exactly as it island. In this state, you don't fear being unseen. You don't crave recognition. You don't demand results. You move, and the movement carries authority, not yours, but something higher. Something unmistakable. You live the prayer of every spiritual tradition, every metaphysical teaching, every mystical longing. Not my will, but thy will through me. Let the light pass through. There will be times when you see what others cannot. You'll feel the distortion in a conversation before a word is spoken. You'll notice the fear under someone's certainty. You'll sense the pattern behind the behavior, and your instinct may be to speak, to guide, to offer clarity. But there's a deeper invitation in those moments. Not to teach, not to correct, not to be right, but to hold the field. When you live from Christ consciousness, your presence becomes a stabilizing force. Not because you dominate the energy of the room, but because you no longer contribute to its distortion. You don't feed the loops. You don't add noise to noise. You remain calm, clear, available. And in that remaining, others feel something different. Even if they don't know what it island, this is the rise. You begin to understand that true service is not always visible. That the deepest transformation often happens when you don't engage in the way the world expects. That your refusal to react, defend, or agree with illusion is itself a sacred act. You may be in the presence of projection, accusation, confusion. You may witness someone clinging to a belief that you know is false. You may see the suffering that pattern is causing, and still, you say nothing. Not because you're passive, because you're anchored. Because the field you hold, the inner climate of clarity, is more effective than any well-worded insight. And you don't need to impose it. You embody it. And embodiment speaks louder than explanation ever could. But that clarity comes with cost. This is the sink. Because holding the field means letting go of being understood. It means living without the approval of those still operating in confusion. It means standing silent in moments when your old self would have fought, defended, or rescued. And that silence, it will ache. You'll watch people misinterpret your stillness. They'll call it avoidance, coldness, pride. They'll try to draw you back into familiar dynamics. They'll invite you into their storm. And the ache won't come from their misunderstanding. It will come from your readiness to be misunderstood for the sake of alignment. This is the true maturity of spiritual presence. Knowing that not every moment needs your words, your insight, or your intervention. Some moments need your absence from reaction. Some need your refusal to match energy. Some need you to be the one thing in the room that does not shift with the tension. Because clarity, once stabilized, becomes a field of transmission, not to convert others, but to remind them silently, energetically, that something else is possible. This is the break. When you stop using clarity to elevate yourself and start using it to hold space for others, even when they cannot yet hold it for themselves, you become the lighthouse, not the lifeboat. You don't chase, you don't drag people into truth. You stand, radiate, wait. And when the storm breaks, because it always does, they'll remember where the signal was. You'll notice it in small ways. The friend who once resisted your silence calls you in tears, ready now. The colleague who dismissed your steadiness begins to steady themselves. The partner who wanted your softness now craves your strength. They begin to reflect back the field you held, even when they didn't understand it. This is the invisible work of the Christ mind, holding a frequency others cannot yet name, and never lowering it to be relatable. You don't rise above. You stand within, not with pride, with presence, with the grounded awareness that truth never rushes, never begs, and never defends. It waits. Let the field hold. Eventually, you realize the path was never about fixing the world outside. It was always about seeing it rightly. And right seeing doesn't mean changing everything you look at. It means letting everything be what it is without distortion, without drama, without dragging your past into the present moment. This is the quiet arrival, the end of projection, the moment when you no longer overlay your fears, your hopes, your unmet needs onto reality. You don't demand it to validate you. You don't twist it to confirm your story. You don't reach for signs. You just look and you see. It feels like breathing after holding your breath for years. That exhale is truth, not poetic truth, functional truth, the kind that clears a room, the kind that doesn't require an audience, the kind that lets people be as they are not because you've transcended, but because you've stopped translating them through your wounds. This is the rise. You walk into the same relationships, the same conversations, the same patterns, and they don't pull you under, not because they've changed, because you're not carrying projection into them. You're no longer needing others to be anything but what they are. You're no longer relating from the hungry part of your mind that once cried out, "See me, save me, complete me." And what you find in that clarity is freedom. Not from others, but from yourself as you once were. The self that needed to defend. The self that needed to control. The self that needed the story to go a certain way to feel safe. You don't need that anymore. And so the world begins to feel different. Not because the world shifted, but because your perception has been cleansed. You are no longer viewing life through the smoke of your past. But there is grief in this. This is the sink. Because you begin to see how long you misunderstood people, how many stories you projected, how often you defended illusions instead of inviting truth. You look back at old dynamics and see what was real and what was built on shadow. It humbles you. It breaks you. Not into shame, but into reverence. Reverence for how powerful perception really island. Reverence for how much pain is created not by what happens but by how we see it. Reverence for how easily the mind wraps meaning around events to protect itself from feeling. And reverence for the beauty of life as it is, when seen without interference. This break isn't collapse, it's completion. The completion of a cycle where life had to teach you through experience what you would not see through stillness. Now, you are still, and from stillness, you can see. You begin to see how much of your life was built on misperception, not because you were wrong, but because you were protecting yourself from pain, from abandonment, from irrelevance, from emptiness. And now, with those protectors laid down, perception becomes pure. Not sanitized, not idealistic, just clean. You see people clearly flawed, beautiful, sacred. You see your path clearly twisted, redemptive, holy. You see the now clearly complete, unrepeatable, and enough. From here, your decisions begin to emerge differently. You don't choose from fear of lack. You don't move to be seen. You don't reach for healing as a performance. You act from inner stillness, and your actions carry authority. This is the break. Not between you and others, between you and illusion. It is the final untangling. The moment where you stop pulling at the threads of your life trying to make them make sense, and instead, you put the needle down. You rest in the tapestry as it island. And in doing so, you become whole. You were never broken. You were only blind. And now that you see, you don't need more vision. You need presence. So you walk not ahead of yourself, not behind, but with the moment, with truth, with life. With the Christ mind, not as a distant ideal, but as the current reference through which you see, speak, and move. Let that be enough. At last you realize, right seeing is not something you practice, it's something you become. It's no longer a tool you reach for in difficulty, it's the lens through which every breath, every glance, every decision passes. There is no fanfare in this final shift. No heavenly trumpet, no dramatic flash of enlightenment. Just a quiet settling into what's always been true. A return not to the self you constructed, but to the awareness that's been silently watching it all along. You live now from the center, not the emotional center, not the intellectual center, the spiritual center, the part of you untouched by history, undisturbed by future. The part of you Emmet Fox described as the Christ within, the true identity, the point of contact with the infinite. And, what's most stunning? There is nothing left to prove. No need to articulate your clarity. No need to broadcast your peace. No urge to correct the world. You live the truth without decoration. Your inner gaze remains steady whether others notice or not. Whether the room agrees or not. Whether your path makes sense to anyone else or not. You are free. Because you no longer walk through life measuring yourself by outcomes. You no longer ask your experiences to mirror your worth. You don't wait for validation to proceed. You move from knowing. And that knowing? It doesn't shout, it doesn't persuade, it doesn't react. It simply moves through you, as you, without strain, without doubt, without interference. This is the rise, not to some mountaintop of eternal bliss, but into the rhythm of everyday holiness, the peace that settles into your bones, the joy that doesn't spike but hums, the presence that doesn't perform but transforms. But there is also a soft ache here. This is the sync, because you now see, with unmistakable clarity, how rare this frequency is in the world. How many walk blind, not out of stubbornness, but out of pain? How many are still trying to feel safe by staying asleep? How many would rather defend the illusion than receive the freedom? And you feel it not as burden, but as compassion, not as pity, but as service. Because now, your life is not just yours. It's a vessel, a light, a reference point. This is the break. The break from identification, the break from striving, the break from any version of self that still needed to earn love. Now, you don't carry love. You are it. Not as concept, not as feeling, as being, as the native frequency of one who sees rightly, lives simply, and walks forward without resistance. You will still feel things. You will still grieve, still laugh, still get tired. But the lens won't change. The seeing won't blur. The clarity won't leave you. Because it's no longer borrowed. It's home. You've stopped chasing transformation and become the space in which it happens. Let that be your walk, your rhythm, your gift. Let the Christ light shine not ahead of you or behind but through. And let that be enough. So now, beloved soul, you've walked the full map from the first flicker of awareness to the full stillness of seeing. You've touched the illusions, traced their roots, and found your way back not to a new version of you, but to the original one. The watcher, the witness, the quiet eye of truth. Breathe here, without effort. Nothing more to learn, nothing more to fix. You are not arriving, you have arrived. Let your shoulders drop, let your heart slow, let the field around you settle into order. You've remembered something that cannot be forgotten now, that clarity is not a moment, it's a frequency. And once you live in it, even the most ordinary moments become holy ground. The room you're in is now a sanctuary, not because of what it contains, but because of how you're seeing it. The Christ light moves through you, not to make you more special, but to make you transparent. You don't need to shine, you just need to stay out of the way. Live from this place, speak from this stillness, serve from this knowing. And if the noise returns, as it will, don't panic, don't chase, just watch, just wait, just remember what you now know. The light hasn't left, it never does. It waits for the mind to quiet, for the eyes to clear, for the gate to open. And when it does, you'll walk forward again, calm, clean, certain, not as someone who knows everything, but as someone who finally sees,